when he failed, he seemed to be able to improve after that, which showed that he must have some sort of resilience that not many players have got. He's in the top 10 based on achievements. If that's the case, he's top 5. I think it's the final that everybody wanted, and it just so happened that it delivered an incredible comeback.
Hello, welcome back to Pluto TV and the MODUS Super Series for the latest edition of The Story Of, where we delve into the careers of some of the greatest players to have ever played the game. And today we have a look back at the career of the 5-time world champion Raymond van Barneveld, a trailblazer in his native Netherlands and one of the most recognisable players that the sport has ever seen. Now, Paul Nicholson has faced Raymond van Barneveld on many a stage, many a game, and he really is one of the most iconic players in the sport, isn't he?
Without question. I think the impact that Raymond had in the 1990s is still being felt. But I think what people don't really understand is just how long the Netherlands have had darts tournaments and had players well before Raymond's time. But I think the importance of Ray coming through was that he was able to show the next generation of Dutch dart players that would follow him that great riches and great success is there if you can dedicate yourself the way that he did.
And when he did break through, and we'll talk obviously more about some of his successes as the show goes along, but when he found that initial success, the landscape completely changed, as you mentioned. The TV coverage he was getting, I mean, to the point where he went back to Amsterdam Schiphol Airport, and there was basically people waiting at the reception for him to greet him after winning.
Yeah, this is true. I think the Dutch Open started, 50 years ago? More than 50 years ago. And there were Dutch dart players before him. But you think about him getting a 170 check out at Lakeside early in his career, making the final in 1995 where he would lose out to Richie Burnett. These are really, really big things. He was showing the Netherlands that a superstar was in wait, and it wouldn't take him too much longer to become world champion, and he would eventually defend it. But he did become a superstar, and you think about the other Dutch players at the time that were, trailing him because he was the best player they had. People like Roland Scholten, Koos Stompe, and some others. He was not just a Dutch star, but a world star.
And the word superstar in darts can sometimes be oversold, but it can't be in Raymond's case.
Not at all. You just mentioned the Schiphol incident. Well, incident. The timing of that was very apt because he was about to change the sport for the better. I think the amount of tournaments he was winning in the late 90s and the early 2000s, it showed the capability of him not just to play the game, but to be the figurehead of an organization. Because between, let's say, 1998 and 2006, he was the most important player that the BDO had. They held on to him as long as they possibly could. And in that 8-year period, he won an awful lot.
He most definitely did. 4 world titles during his time in the BDO. But as you mentioned, the first one didn't quite go to plan against Richie Burnett in 1995. We've mentioned it in previous conversations that probably at that point, Richie was, regardless of whatever your thoughts were on the split, Richie was in a lot of people's eyes the best player in the world at that point in time. And for Raymond, he was kind of the number 2 at that period, really, wasn't he? He established himself that way.
Yeah, he was one of the best players in the world at the time. Steve Beaton, Richie Burnett. There were other players that were better than Raymond at this period, but you've got to remember how difficult it was for an overseas player to win Lakeside and, say, a World Masters and things like that. It's very hard. And it took him a few years to break that ceiling and, really break through. I think Raymond's attitude towards darts has been, I'm going to do this and I'm going to give it everything I've got. But I think he always had a self-belief that some players have never had. He said, I'm going to do this. And I think there was a line from Sid Waddell once about Raymond. He said, he's so good, he could actually throw the letters through the letterbox when he used to be a postal worker. And there have been quite a few good postal workers in darts, like Joe Cullen, Dieter Hedman, and some others. But Raymond's attitude was one of, I'm going to do this, whether anybody likes it or not. And he would break through.
He would, and I suppose, as quirk would have it, it was against Richie Burnett, in which he did it back in 1998.
Yeah, I think sometimes people forget, don't they, that if you're going to be a great of this sport, not every one of them win their first world final. And there are examples of this, great examples. Michael van Gerwen, first world final, lost to Philip Douglas Taylor. Luke Littler, lost to Luke Humphreys. Raymond van Barneveld, lost to Burnett, beat Burnett. There are many players who have been through these kind of things to make themselves feel more equipped to be a world champion a little bit further on. So maybe it was fitting that it was Richie Burnett who was the victim in 1998.
And then he did something which seldom happened. I think prior to that point, only Everett Bristow did it, and that was to retain the title a year later.
And at this point, we're starting to talk about darts differently, because if you think back to 1994, the first year after the split, you've got Taylor and Priestley and everybody else going to the then WDC. And there was a lot of chatter in darts magazines and in pubs and clubs around the world saying which is the stronger of the two organizations. And most people at the time said, well, we actually think the BDO is stronger in depth. So they were looking at John Part winning in 1994 saying, well, maybe one of the good things that can come of this is that overseas players will now thrive a bit more than the better domestic players like Taylor, Bristow, Wilson, Priestley, and many others who went to the then WDC. So maybe this happening around 93 was meant to be, because it allowed people like Raymond and John Part and some others to break through. And think about Tony David in 2002, he was the same.
And then it was very quickly established. Raymond van Barneveld's the BDO's best player. Phil Taylor's the best player in the PDC at that particular moment in time. And a bit like in boxing, you know, when you have a WBC belt holder and an IBF belt holder, for example, you want that unification match. Now, ITV Sport hadn't broadcast darts since the days of World of Sport, but they decided to, in 1999, host a challenge match, which was a little bit different to perhaps what you're used to seeing in terms of it was against the clock. You had 1 hour to win as many legs as possible. It was a weird concept, a different concept, one that hasn't been used since.
Yeah, but it was different. And most of the time doing something different is good. I remember watching it, seeing the clock tick away, and people were excited about the prospect of having a darts match where it was united. Because at the time, the politics between the PDC and the BDO, it was vicious. It was venom in the air. You could barely breathe as a PDC player going into a BDO venue if they would allow you in. So this was a nice breath of fresh air to say, do you know what? Maybe darts can coexist on some level, even if it's just for a night. So yes, best player in the BDO against best player in the PDC. It was a great event. But what I took from that at the time, I was starting to learn about what Raymond was all about. Lost his first world final, ended up winning in 1998, and then he loses to Taylor at the challenge match in 99. But the thing is, when he failed, he seemed to be able to improve after that, which showed that he must have some sort of resilience that not many players have got.
Then there'd be a couple of lean years. He went out first round in the next tournament to Chris Mason. Then the World Masters, okay, he won a couple of them. But then there was a period where he was going a few years without drinks at the Lakeside, despite being the main character still at that tournament.
It wasn't an easy thing to win. There were players who were really starting to come to the fore. I remember 2001, and months out we were saying, John Walton's winning this. He's just playing so brilliantly. And it was pretty much nailed on because John was so confident. There were better players in these years than Raymond van Barneveld. 2002, Tony David was an extraordinary form. And as far as 2004 is concerned, maybe it was just destiny that Andy Fordham was going to win, but he played in the semi-final against Andy Fordham, had a lead, wasn't able to keep that lead, and Andy was able to get through and play Mervyn in the final.
He'd win 2 more championships in 2003, 2005. Actually beat Martin Adams in that final, fantastic final. And then we get to 2006, where there were murmurs, there were rumours that Raymond may possibly switch. And there was an infamous interview with David Croft at the Lakeside where Barney had to bat away a lot of difficult questions, and it almost felt like that tournament was perhaps overshadowed in terms of what could happen next for Raymond van Barneveld, and but particularly for the BDO, because as we mentioned, he was their pin-up boy. If you were going to talk about Lakeside at that time, you're going to talk about the BDO World Championship at that time. Raymond van Barneveld was probably the first name that stuck in your mind. He was the poster boy, the trailblazer for that event.
Unquestionably. This was a Europe-wide, worldwide tournament that people enjoyed watching once a year. Darts was not in the place that it is right now. So when it came to January time, people expected to turn on their television set and see Raymond van Barneveld playing at Lakeside. So if that wasn't going to happen, people were going to start asking questions. Most people were darts casuals back then. They would watch once, possibly twice a year. If you had Sky Sports, you were a darts fanatic. It's as simple as that. But things were changing around about this point. We had people going to the PDC in the early 2000s, the likes of Richie Burnett and Steve Beaton and Kevin Painter and lots of other players. These were perceived as the best domestic players, and some of the other players had moved as well. People like Roland Shelton. That was a big move. And what people don't tend to forget, or tend to remember, is that the first Dutch player to play at the PDC World Championship was Braulio Ranchero. It wasn't Koh-Stompé, it wasn't Roland Shelton, it wasn't Raymond van Barneveld, it was Braulio Ranchero, and he deserves a mention. But we're starting to see at this point more people moving over because the prize money was getting better, the deals with the match play, the Grand Prix, the Premier League was starting. Mm-hmm. This was changing the whole spectrum of the sport, and the power was about to shift. And I think Raymond, who did bat away some questions, as did Mervyn King in that championship, they were saying, do you know what? Maybe this is the right time for us to jump ship, because our careers, they don't span 5-10 years. It might span 20 to 30.
Let's talk about the move then, over to the PDC in 2006. And it was a bit like a transfer deadline day scenario where we see Raymond at this press conference signing contracts. And for Barry Hearn, he got his man, the man that they wanted. And it felt like that was the moment where the PDC said to everybody else, we are the main organisation, when the BDO's main player had decided to switch.
It's absolutely fair. I remember some of the advertisements around events at that point, and they were saying it's going to be Barneveld versus Taylor, it's going to be Barneveld versus the PDC. But he was PDC from that point. Now, there was a transfer involved. There was money involved, which a lot of people at the time knew about. But in order to get the best player to join the PDC at the time, these kind of things happened. People were getting incentives to come over, and the incentive was Premier League darts. And he would prove very quickly that he belonged in the PDC at the top level, because he'd be world champion within a year, UK Open champion very, very quickly, in Premier League darts with a 9-darter, and at this point, people are thinking Taylor's dominance is in real trouble.
Yeah, he won the UK Open in 2006 within months of coming over. Was that the beginning of a statement of intent for Barney?
That tournament was a statement of intent. At this point, you're seeing Raymond celebrating like he's never celebrated before. Think back to 98 when he won Lakeside for the first time. He was on his knees, crying with his head in his hands, and he's in disbelief. But when he's winning a UK Open match against some of the best players in the PDC, he's jumping up and down like he's on a pogo stick. He's thinking, do you know what? Let me off the leash. And it was great to see the perceived etiquette within the BDO system with the old school players. It was one of play, shake hands, get off, and then wait for the MC to say your name, and then you would leave. It was very strict and stringent. And if you broke protocol in any way, shape or form in this system, you were frowned upon. But in the PDC, you were encouraged to celebrate and to show your emotions. And that's what Sky Sports really wanted as well. And Raymond was thoroughly on board with this.
And as we knew, the move over to the PDC would mean a rivalry with Phil Taylor, which would come to its culmination at the Circus Tavern in 2007. Many people say, even now, it's the greatest game that's ever been played. Before we get to that final, it never nearly happened because Colin Lloyd, who was the world number 1 at the time, Raymond went into it as the number 2 seed. A lot of people thought that was Colin's best chance of winning the World Championship. Had the opportunity to get him gone, but couldn't.
Yeah, I'm sure Lloydie's lost a few nights' sleep because of those missed darts, but we've all been in matches like that. It just so happened that it's a sliding doors moment for the career of Raymond van Barneveld, because if he doesn't win that match against Lloydie, he probably is a person who never wins a PDC World Championship, which changes his entire career. So we all need games where someone doesn't get over the line to allow you to do so. And it just so happens that Lloydie was not able to win that match, and Raymond would obviously go on to make the final that Sky Sports wanted. I think it's the final that everybody wanted. And it just so happened that it delivered an incredible comeback and an extraordinary amount of 180s.
And it's very rare that a game like that delivers on a scale like that, because how many times do we see, say in other sports, say like in football, you have a final between Man United and Liverpool, or boxing, you've got an undisputed heavyweight contest, and it just doesn't live up to type. This final lived up to the billing and more.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you think about the early part of the final, and it tells you something about the mentalities of the players. Phil was wearing an orange shirt. Now, I don't know why he chose to do that. He'd end up changing the shirt later on to a white one. Smart move, because the Circus Tavern is insanely hot on that stage when it's got 1,500 people in there. I can't imagine what that atmosphere was like in there. Them seeing this game the way it panned out, they must be thinking this is history in the making. The last leg will live in infamy. I don't really subscribe to it being the best game ever played. I have others that I prefer, but that's totally subjective. But I can admit that I never saw it live, because even at this stage, not everybody around the world was able to watch darts live. But that was about to change, and that's one of the things that this match, Raymond and Phil need to take credit for, because that game had everybody talking around the world, and maybe we should start showing darts live wherever we are.
Probably the most infamous leg in history. Obviously, you had the 25, the ball, and the 180s. And one thing I'll never forget about that final was when that last dart went in, and the iconic line that John Gwynn came out with, and Barneveld is the champion of the world. His arms are hoist in the air. He had achieved what he wanted to from the outset of movement in the space of 12 months. It was mission accomplished for him.
Yeah, it was. That's the iconic bit, isn't it? John gave the line, Raymond gave the pose, and the entire tournament had its perfect finish. And it was the last one at the Circus Tavern as well. Change was coming. People thought at that point that maybe the dominant Phil Taylor days were about to come to an end. Boy, were they wrong. Boy, were they wrong. Raymond thought at this point, I'm going to be the man now. I am the man. And he was. But what we learned from Raymond was that he was able to succeed after failure. But Taylor was about to do that to him in the same way, and they would battle for years after that.
They would battle, but I suppose people expected a more equally weighted rivalry between the pair. After the UK Open in 2007, we'd have to wait all the way to 2012 on the Grand Slam for him to win his next one, where, again, you could possibly say another sliding door moments where he beat Michael van Gerwen in the final. At that point, was beginning to become the real force in the sport.
Shouldn't really underestimate just what that final did for Phil. It allowed him to improve. It showed that he had to improve again. He did. And big titles were hard to win in that period. People were just joining the tour. People were coming back after hiatuses because they saw the amount of money that was on offer. But around 2012, Raymond had changed manufacturers. He had been fiddling with the way his darts were sitting in the board. But that Grand Slam, he looked very different. He looked very focused. Michael was trying to take the mantle of Raymond's best player in the Netherlands. Now, Phil had been taking the mantle of best player in the world, and Raymond was okay with, right, I'm trying to hunt him down. But now from the back, he's got players like Klaassen and Van der Voort and Van Gerwen saying, do you know what, we want your title, Raymond. We want to be the number one in the Netherlands. And I think that scared him into playing better.
And then 2014, the Premier League, I suppose the golden one for him, because that was where the journey began.
Yeah, I think so. Certain careers you feel deserve a Premier League title, but you have to go and get it. And Raymond was able to do that. And I think if you'd said to him after that 2014 Premier League, that's going to be the end of your career, he might have said, you know what, I'm very proud of what I've achieved, but it just goes to show there was more to find, but things were about to get tumultuous.
Well, let's get into that. He decided to retire at the end of 2019. He announced it around about 18 months out, played the Premier League in his final year. That didn't go to plan. He initially said one night that he wanted to retire on the spot. He overturned that decision. And then it ended on a real sour note, didn't it, at the World Championships? Obviously, the build-up was kind of similar to what Phil had in his last year, but going out in the first round, it left a little bit of a sour taste in the mouth.
Yeah, it just didn't feel right. You've got to give credit to Darren Young. He played well. Mm-hmm. And this is not something that, Raymond wanted, but it's something he'd been through before. He lost to James Richardson in 2012, and nobody saw that coming. So first round exits, they hurt. But when it is your last time, that's not the goodbye that you wanted. So maybe that's one of the reasons why he came back, because he didn't get the end that he felt he deserved.
In terms of the U-turn, took a year out of the sport, decided to come back in 2021. Obviously, in terms of major successes, he's made a Grand Slam semi-final, hasn't quite made the inroads that perhaps he would have done in recent years. A, were you surprised that he decided to overturn his retirement? And B, what do you think is left for Raymond?
I think deep down, coming back was based on a year. When he was away from the sport as a competing professional, he's probably gone to exhibitions and said to himself, you know what, I can still play this game to the top level. I can still beat all these guys. But when you consider the financial rewards that are available on the PDC Pro Tour, if he was to get through Q School like he did, he could make an impact really quickly, which he did. But I think he's starting to manage his schedule better than he did before, purely based on the fact that he's not going to World Series. He's not going to Premier League. He can actually be a Pro Tour player. He's not the main man anymore, but he can still make a decent living playing darts close to home, places like Rosmalen, places on the European Tour. He can still make his adoring fans very, very happy, but it's got to be selfish. This is a selfish sport. It can be a lonely sport as well. And he has had his personal problems. He's been through blackmailing incidents. There have been tabloid issues. He's been through a divorce. These aren't easy to handle. And people don't give dart players enough credit for being able to do what they're best at through tumultuous times personally.
Finally, in terms of the all-time list of players, where does Raymond rank for you?
He's in the top 10, but I think it's based on context. Is it based on achievements? If that's the case, he's top 5. If it's based on players playing their best darts against another player when they're playing their best darts, he's just inside the top 10, because his ceiling of performance is not as good as some of the other greats like Peter Wright, Gary Anderson, Phil Taylor, Michael van Gerwen. They're all better than him. But as far as achievements and legacy, hugely a top 5 player of all time.
5 world titles, a Premier League, Grand Slam, couple of UK Opens. Wasn't a bad career, was it? Thank you for watching the story of here on Pluto TV. Do join us for the next edition.